Okay, sorry for the delay. Because we have this Wacom device that we use for writing. That's why we are having this driver technical problems. That's why it took a little bit while. So now we are back. So I guess we can start our third chapter of this course, International Trade, Theory and Policy. So this chapter is a little bit big. We have more than 100 slides, but most of the slides are examples that you can refer to. So it will be easy to understand the concepts raised in this course. So I think some students are still couldn't log in. So I'll just try to copy the you can log in using the URL if it is not allowing you to. So I guess it is okay now. So as I've said, this chapter is a little bit big. We have so many examples and it's a little bit technical, so I'll try my best to explain. There are so many examples, so these examples will help you easily figure out what these concepts are. So as we have discussed in previous chapters, there are two major reasons why countries engage in international trade, right? So one reason, okay, so there are two reasons that we have. The first reason why this is not right. Okay, yeah. Thank you. So there are two reasons why we engage or businesses engage in international trade. Okay, so the first one is because every country is different, right? And the difference in resources, the difference in producing capacity, there are so many differences that countries have. So they can make up for their differences. Okay, so that is the first reason why countries engage in international trade, because nations, like individuals, can benefit from each other, right? So something that I have, and so there are some things I have that you don't have, and there are some things you have but I don't have. So nations also have the same characteristics, right? So nations share what they have with the other nations, and they also share what they don't have from other nations. Okay, so that difference has resulted in the need for countries to engage in international trade. Okay, and the other is the economies of scale. Okay. So the economies of scale here is to mean economies of, sorry, economies of scale is the other reason. So economies of scale means when a country produces more of the same product, the production cost decreases. Okay? So this means when a country specializes in producing a single product, then that specialization helps a country to reduce the cost of production so that they can sell this product at a cheaper price. So the specialization is the second reason why countries engage in international trade. Okay, so these two are the major reasons why nations engage in international trade. So in this chapter, we'll talk about some major issues in international trade. So I want you to know that there are three major, and you can say four production means of productions. Okay, factors of production, you can say factors of production. So the first is land, second is labor, third is capital, okay, fourth is entrepreneurship. Okay, so these are the factors of production. So we need land, we need labor, we need capital, we need entrepreneurship. Okay, I'm using this overview because in this first few topics, we will be talking about only one of the means of production. So we will be focusing on land. And our examples will be considering only land as a means of production. Okay? And so I think if this is clear, let's go to the goals or the objectives of this course. Okay, so we have three major objectives. Okay, so the first objective is to explain how the Ricardian model. So there is a model called Ricardian. So we'll be talking in this chapter about Ricardian model and what is Ricardian model. Okay, and how it works. So explain how Ricardian model, the most basic model of international trade, works and how it illustrates the principle of comparative advantage. Okay, so we'll talk about Ricardian model. Okay, so I want you to focus on this. That is one major objective of this course. I mean this chapter, Ricardian model and what is comparative advantage. Okay, one objective. Second objective is demonstrate the gains from trade and refute common fallacies about international trade. There are fallacies or there are wrong assumptions about international trade. So we'll talk about what these wrong assumptions are, and we will talk about the gains from trade. Okay, and fallacies. And the third goal of this chapter is to describe the empirical evidence that wages reflect productivity and that trade patterns reflect relative productivity. So we'll be talking about wage and trade patterns. Okay. So I want you to keep this as an overview. First thing, the reason why we trade, okay? There are two major reasons. The first reason is because nations as individuals are different and they have to make up for this difference among them, okay? And the other overview I want you to know is there are four factors of production, And from these 4 factors of production, we will be talking more about land in this chapter, okay? But we have land, I'm sorry. Not land, we'll be talking about labor, okay? So there are 4 factors of production. We have land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship. We will be talking more about labor today, okay? And the third thing I want you to know is the goal of this chapter. First is to know about Ricardian model and comparative advantage. Second is to know about the gains from trade. Third is to know about wage and trade patterns to understand the empirical evidence, okay? So apart from this, there are so many details, so I don't want you to worry about this, so many mathematical computations. Just focus on these 3 objectives to understand this one, and this one, okay? Okay, let's go to our preview. So the preview says opportunity cost and comparative advantage. So there is what we call comparative advantage and absolute advantage, okay? But when we say comparative advantage, we are talking about opportunity cost. So in international trade, when we say a company is competitive enough, we are referring to comparative advantage, not absolute advantage, okay? So in this chapter, you will identify what is absolute advantage and what is comparative advantage. And as I've said, in international trade, we focus on comparative advantage, not absolute advantage, okay? And comparative advantage is when you see the opportunity cost, okay? And the other is production possibilities. There are production possibility frontier and trade production possibility frontier. So we'll talk about this production possibility frontier and what does it mean, okay? So there is one theory called PPF, and sometimes there is also TPF, so we'll talk about this too. Production possibility frontier and trade possibility frontier, okay? And the third one is relative supply, relative demand, and relative prices. So when we engage in international trade, we are comparing with other nations' products, right? So we have to consider the supply relative to other countries' supply, demand relative to other countries' demand, prices relative to other countries' prices. So that is a relative supply, relative demand, and relative price issues. So we'll talk about them. Then trade possibilities and gains from trade. Okay, what do nations gain from trade? We'll talk about that, and we'll talk about wage and trade. Okay, and we'll talk about at the last we'll talk about misconceptions about comparative advantage. Okay, and we will also talk about transportation and transportation cost and non-traded goods and some empirical evidences that will help us understand how wages and trade patterns reflect the relative productivity of a country, okay? So this is just an overview. Let's start our first topic, that is in the introduction part, okay? So sources of differences across countries that lead to gains from trade. As I've said in the beginning, the reason why nations engage in international trade, first reason is the difference, okay? So nations are different in resource, okay? It could be in natural resource, it could be labor, it could be in capital, okay? Or it could be in skill. So countries are different. For example, South Korea doesn't have the same natural resources as the US or Europe, okay? South Korea doesn't have similar labor skill as the US or Europe. Okay, South Korea doesn't have, you can say, labor requirement or other factors of production with similar to other nations. So these differences have invited countries to share what they miss. Okay, so you produce something, you sell it to the other nations, and you buy goods for which you cannot produce in your own country. Okay, so this chapter talks more about the Ricardian model. Okay, Ricardian model examines differences in the productivity of labor due to differences in technology between countries. Okay, so Ricardian model, okay, poses, or Ricardian model tries to tell us that international trade is mainly because of changes or differences in the productivity of labor. Okay, there are other models that say productivity of labor is not the only reason why nations involved in international trade. But for Ricardian model, productivity of labor is the main reason for international trade, and it is main determinant for a country to engage in international trade. Okay, but in later chapters, like chapter 5, we'll see this Orlean model, which examines difference in labor, difference in labor skills, difference in physical capital, in land, and other factors of production between countries. Okay, so as I've said, in this chapter, we will be focusing only on productivity of labor as a means of production. Okay, so when we see examples, you have to think of labor as the major determinant of international trade. Okay, maybe in the later chapters we will talk about other factors like labor, land or capital. Okay. Okay, then. These are Ricardian model assumptions. So let's state the assumptions, and when we explain or when we do some examples, we will be basing our assumptions on this 8 assumptions of the Ricardian model. Okay, so Ricardian model assumes 2 countries, one domestic, one foreign. Okay, and 2 goods, wine and cheese. So in our example, we will be having wine and cheese as a comparison. Okay, country producing wine, country producing cheese. Okay, so domestic country might produce wine, foreign country might produce cheese, or domestic country produces cheese and foreign country produces wine. Okay, and we do our examples or discussions on these 2 goods. Labor is the only resource needed for production. So this is the assumption by Ricardian model, that labor is the only resource needed for production. Okay, so we know for a fact that it's not only labor. We need capital, we need land, we need entrepreneur skills. Okay, but for this explanation, then we have assumed that labor is the only resource needed for production. Okay, and the 4th assumption is labor productivity is constant. Okay, 5th, labor productivity varies across countries due to differences in technology. So this means, for example, 2 people in or 2 units of labor in domestic country might produce 1 gallon of wine, but in a foreign country, only 1 person can produce 1 gallon of wine. So labor productivity, okay, labor productivity in domestic and in foreign might be different because of differences in technology. Okay, And the sixth assumption is the supply of labor in each country is constant. Okay, so we don't think that there is a lot of labor here and few labor here. So we think that supply of labor in each of these two countries is constant. And the seventh assumption is labor makes, markets are competitive, okay? Competitive in a sense. So if you pay more, you'll get more labor forces, okay? And the eighth assumption is workers are mobile across sectors, okay? So keep these 8 assumptions in mind, and when we do examples or when we do some explanations, then our assumptions are based on these 8 listed assumptions, okay? So let's talk about comparative advantage. Suppose that the domestic country has a comparative advantage in cheese production. So when we say a domestic country has a comparative advantage in cheese production, it means that its opportunity cost of producing cheese is lower than the opportunity cost in the foreign country. Okay, so I want you to also understand what is opportunity cost. So opportunity cost is a trade-off, right? So a domestic country can produce both cheese and wine, but the opportunity cost of producing cheese is, let's say, lower than the opportunity cost of producing wine. Okay, so you produce cheese more. Okay, and this opportunity cost is the reason why countries trade. Okay, because opportunity cost is what determines comparative advantage. Okay, so you can, I will give you another example. For example, you are studying, right? And you want to be, let's say, a business executive, right? But you could have been involved in other businesses, right? You could have been a merchant, but you are a student, you are studying. So the opportunity cost, the rationally, in rational thinking wise, the opportunity cost of being a merchant is less. Okay, I mean the opportunity cost of being an executive, business executive, is less. That's why you are studying. If the opportunity cost is very high compared to being a merchant, then you would have been involved in business and being a merchant. Okay? So whenever you gain something, you lose something, right? So the opportunity cost is the thing that you lose should not be greater than the things that you gain, right? That is called a lesser opportunity cost. So opportunity cost is something we lose, okay? So I'll give you another simple example, okay? Let's say here there is US and there is Cambodia, okay? US produces computers, okay? Cambodia produces flowers, okay? Because of, for example, the natural weather, in Cambodia you can, because the season in Cambodia and US are different. For example, in the when it is winter in the US, it might be summer in Cambodia, okay? And they produce flowers and they sell it to the US, okay? But the US could have produced flowers in the winter, right? Because they can use greenhouse and they can produce flowers. But the thing is, the cost of producing flowers in the US is higher than the cost of producing flowers in Cambodia, right? So the US, instead of investing in flowers, they can invest more on computers, okay? So they can use all these resources or all this finance that would have been invested on flowers to computers, and they can produce more computers, okay? But if they want to produce flowers, they have to decrease, okay? They have to, sorry. If they want to produce flower, they have to decrease the production of computers because they have to invest now on flowers, right? So we are thinking two products only at the same time, okay? So take that into consideration. So as I've said, it is economical and the opportunity cost is lower for the US to buy flowers from Cambodia and just focus on producing computers, because the opportunity cost of producing flowers is higher for the US, okay? So if the opportunity cost is high, then you don't have to produce these products in your own country. You could have used this effort, this finance in producing other things where you can have the advantage of the opportunity cost, okay? So, as I've said, in comparative advantage, we consider the opportunity cost. Comparative advantage, it doesn't mean you cannot produce. It means that you could have used that money in investing other things that you might excel on and you might have been profitable than investing too much money on something that you are not good at, okay? You are not good at because of the weather, you are not good at because of the skills, okay? But absolute advantage is different. I'll talk about that later on. Absolute advantage means you and only you can produce that, and if you produce that, no country can compete and win you, okay? And that we don't use absolute advantage for international trade, okay? We use opportunity cost, okay? So even though Cambodia's economy is not or is far from US economy, they can still produce flowers, they can sell it to the US, and with selling the flowers, they can buy computers to their country, okay? So it's not feasible for Cambodia to produce computers because the opportunity cost of producing computers is very high, okay? So they just focus on producing flowers and sell these flowers to the US and buy computers instead from the US. Okay, that is what. So throughout this, the examples are given where we consider opportunity cost to be less when we think of taking the advantage of involving in international trade. Okay. So we say a domestic country has a comparative advantage in cheese production. It means that its opportunity cost of producing cheese is lower than the opportunity cost in the foreign country, okay? So you have to produce cheese, okay? So when the domestic country, so here, this implies domestic, okay, domestic country, and this is for foreign foreign country. Okay, so the asterisk here is used to show this is for a foreign country. So if this is the unit of labor required for cheese, and this is a unit of labor required for wine production. So if the unit of labor required to produce cheese has a lower opportunity cost than producing wine, then a country will produce what? Cheese. Okay, so a domestic country will produce a cheese because it is opportunity cost of producing cheese is lower than the opportunity cost of producing cheese in the foreign country. Okay, so when the domestic country increases cheese production, it reduces wine production. Okay, so I will give you an example on this later on. Okay, so we in a country, so what matters is what quantity of cheese or wine are you trying to produce. Okay, so since the domestic country has higher opportunity cost than the foreign in producing cheese, then they produce more cheese and less wine. Okay, because the foreign country has an opportunity cost, lower opportunity cost of producing wine than the domestic country. Okay, so it reduces wine production less than the foreign country does because the domestic unit labor requirement for cheese production is low compared to wine production. Okay, so that is a point. So now the domestic country will produce both cheese and wine, but they will produce more of cheese. Okay, more cheese, and foreign produce more wine. Okay, less cheese here, but here less wine. Okay, so the quantity of cheese should be higher, the quantity of cheese should be lower. The quantity of wine should be higher, the quantity of cheese should be lower. Okay, so we will see, or we can decide on the quantity later on. Okay, so if the labor in domestic, for example, is 600 and in the foreign is 1000, so how many cheese and how many wine should domestic and foreign countries produce? Then we will see later on. So in this slide, I want you to understand clearly what is a comparative advantage. Okay. Okay. So here, domestic country has an absolute, so this absolute advantage in producing cheese if a unit of labor required to produce cheese is less than a unit of labor required to produce cheese in a foreign country. Okay, so this ALC means unit of labor required to produce cheese. Okay, and this is foreign because we have asterisk. So if the unit of labor required to produce cheese in domestic country is less than the unit of labor required to produce cheese in a foreign country, then we say a domestic country has an absolute advantage. So this needs less labor to produce a pound of cheese than foreign country. Unit, so we are considering just this product. Okay, in comparative advantage, we consider both products. Okay, domestic country producing both cheese and wine, foreign country producing both cheese and wine. In absolute advantage, we consider one product at a time. Okay, so we do not consider 2 or 3 products. We just consider this one product, and that is not good in international market. That's why we are using a comparative advantage where we compare the production of 2 or more products. Okay, so unit labor requirement for cheese production is lower than in the foreign country, then more efficient in producing wine. I mean, producing cheese, the domestic market. So domestic country has an absolute advantage in producing wine if the unit of labor required to produce wine in domestic country is less than unit of labor required to produce wine in a foreign country. Okay. So I will be back after 5 minutes. Okay. So take a break for 5 minutes and we'll be back.